Hello, I'm Kelly Meyers. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I coordinate the Midwest Landscape Initiative. I'm going to spend today a little bit of time with you today to talk about what the Midwest Landscape Initiative is, what we've been up to the last couple of years as we've been forming, who is involved, and where we're going, where we're looking to go to, and then talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we're facing, but some of the opportunities we see in being able to work with groups like the ones who are going to be attending this conference. A little bit of background about myself. I started with the Fish and Wildlife Service a little over 3.5 years ago. Prior to being with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was with the state of Iowa through its Department of Natural Resources for almost 15 years. While I was there, I served as in a legal role as the attorney, ultimately moving up to the Fish and Wildlife Director, where I oversaw all of the conservation and recreation programs for the state, which would include fisheries, wildlife, parks, forestry, conservation law enforcement, and of course all the lands and waters of the state of Iowa. And while I was there, I worked in statewide initiatives as well as regional and federal initiatives, really to try to put together this whole conservation estate or conservation enterprise, to make sure people understood why Iowa was such an important piece of this, why the waters and the lands of Iowa, the migratory pathways that it serves, was important to the whole tapestry of the Midwest. And so in my role now with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm able to work across a broad region of the United States to try to pull together some of these partnerships and work on these connected lands and waters across the entire Midwest. So the Midwest Landscape Initiative, we work across the 13 states of the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And this schematic here just shows how the different colors represent some of the interior regions for the Fish and Wildlife Service that are involved in this as well. I should mention that there are the 3 Canadian provinces. We do have individual projects or some initiatives where we're trying to work with them. But right now we're really focused as we're getting this Midwest Landscape Initiative up and going on the participation with the states and the federal partners in the US region. A little bit of a brief history about the Midwest Landscape Initiative. So we were conceived in 2017 as a forum really to continue some of the important work of the LCCs. In the Midwest, we had some ongoing efforts around monarch conservation. The Mid-American Monarch Conservation Strategy was in development and really starting to take off at that point. And we'd also come off of very successful collaborations on northern long-eared bat, working across state boundaries and across different service offices to ensure that we were putting the right research and monitoring in place to address some of the issues with the northern long-eared bat. In 2018, as part of a work group looking nationally, there was this effort to be looking at landscape level collaborations around the country, again, as the LCCs were shifting and changing. And so in the Midwest, we had put together a work group who just decided to start doing things. We started identifying priorities and really having robust conversation around what were the shared priorities of the service in the states in the Midwest region. And so in 2018, the Midwest Association voted to stand up the Midwest Landscape Initiative. It had a different name then, it was much more cumbersome. And it invited the Fish and Wildlife Service leadership in the regions to join as co-equal partners in this Midwest Landscape Initiative. And as part of the partnership, the service offered me to help coordinate this and move it forward. So our purpose with the Midwest Landscape Initiative is really to provide a forum to identify and implement collaborative approaches for shared regional conservation priorities. And we have developed the MLI consistent with an AFWA resolution on landscape collaboration. The work that I referenced earlier going on nationally, it culminated in this resolution about the best management practices for developing robust and comprehensive landscape level approaches. And so we used that and tried to incorporate all of those best management practices into how we operate the MLI. And we've done so using a really adaptive approach. So I kind of jokingly say we're building the cars, we're driving it down the road. But we try to figure out what works and what's needed. We have really been deliberate in making sure that we provide this really great peer-to-peer place where the states and the service can talk about those long-term goals we have around conservation planning, but we don't want to duplicate or in any way subvert some of the other work that we know is going on. So for example, we know that there is on the ground collaboration happening at every level between the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service, through the joint ventures, through Partners for Wildlife programs, through some of the state committees that are formed. And we're not looking to interfere with or duplicate any of those efforts. What we're really trying to do is provide the planning framework for looking down the road for these big kind of challenges, these bigger issues that we'll face as we go into the future, and say, how can we get aligned better now so that as we move into those spaces in the future, we'll be better organized to be able to address them. So our structure, we have a steering committee that is comprised of MAFA board directors, so state fish and wildlife directors in the Midwest, as well as the regional leadership, so the regional directors for the Fish and Wildlife Service, or their delegates. We then have a technical committee that is comprised of a very a vast array of disciplines. So everyone from a wildlife chief, we have communications specialists, we have research supervisors, we have field biologists. So we have a real breadth of perspective. We have fisheries, we have wildlife, we have planners, we have management biologists. So we have, again, that really large breadth of perspective across that technical committee. And then we have work groups that are identified around the existing priorities of the MLI. And those work groups are comprised of more than just state fish and wildlife agencies and the service. That's really where we start getting into specific objectives and goals around much more defined issues. And so we've pulled in different partners who are working in those spaces that we want to be able to capture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So right now we currently have 11 of the 13 states represented on our committees or work groups. We have every region of the Fish and Wildlife Service represented, and we have across the different programs of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We have USGS participating at every level of the MLI. I reference here the migratory bird joint ventures. We know about the JV8 coming together along the Central Flyaway. We have, of course, this group who's looking to possibly coordinate. And so we're trying to figure out how we can work across the states and work across the regions and be a good partner to a lot of these different initiatives that are going on. Again, not wanting to duplicate, but figuring out where do we have in the Venn diagram, where is there that good overlap where we can be working and leveraging. So we do understand that we have a need for expanded partner engagement. We have spent the last couple of years really trying to reset and make sure that the relationship between the state fish and wildlife agencies and the service is strong in where we've identified some of these shared priorities and our goals. And so now we're ready to take that shared sense of opportunity and figure out how we can expand with some of our partners to leverage some action that we're starting to identify with our different groups. And we're also looking to make sure that we align with other sectors and other federal agencies. Something that was very valuable in the LCC days was having that very broad perspective at the tables when we would come together. And so we want to try to figure out how we can replicate some of the value that really served. We have a cooperative agreement between Fish and Wildlife Service and MAFWA, and I just wanted to highlight that this is really one of our big mechanisms to help get work done. So I help coordinate, I help pull people together, do things like this, try to figure out where we can connect in with people, but there's a lot of work to be done just in pulling together all the different people and committees. And so building off of some successes that the Fish and Wildlife Service had with MAFWA around monarch, and having people who were engaged in helping be in those kind of liaison roles, we have a cooperative agreement in place with MAFWA. And the current cooperative agreement is really focusing on extending the work of our executive level liaison, who happens to be the former director in Minnesota, Ed Bogus, and a technical coordinator who helped write the Mid-American Monarch Conservation Strategy, Claire Beck, who are now working with us and looking to all species at risk and helping us figure out how we get organized around all species at risk in the region. We're also looking to support, find support for improved communications and partner engagement. And so we have some funds in this agreement where we can start to really, kind of leverage some ideas about how we might be able to improve our website, really get the word out about what we're trying to do, and engage more fully across the states and with our different partners. Specifically, we have some very specific work we want to do in this first year, which is improving collaboration among our work groups. We've got some really good ideas going and some strategies starting to come out, but we want to make sure they're really coordinated. So we're bringing in some special effort to do that. We're looking at developing a conservation vision for the Midwest Landscape Initiative. So if anyone's familiar with CCAS, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, they've spent quite a bit of time coming up with what is their unifying vision across the Southeast. And we know we have them across the Midwest. And so we're working to lay out what that is so that people understand when you're getting more connected in with the MLI, this is what we're about. And we're also trying to bake in from the beginning here a feedback loop about our governance and our operations. So having a way to evaluate how we're doing and how we're working so that we can build in that kind of continuous improvement concept into our work. And of course, all of this will culminate in a report that will be delivered to the MAFWA board and to the Fish and Wildlife Service leadership so that they can take appropriate action. So our current priorities in the Midwest Landscape Initiative, we have prioritizing at-risk species and species of greatest conservation need across the Midwest region, developing habitat inventory and assessment tools across the Midwest so that we can evaluate the effectiveness of conservation management actions and also provide for integration and interoperability with other tools. Provide wind energy development support to avoid or mitigate negative wildlife interactions. And finally, this is kind of more of a governance goal, developing and refining a long-lasting governance model and unifying conservation vision across the Midwest region. So I'll show you here in the next couple of slides, and thinking back to that last one, we're kind of working toward all of these at this point. I have this little note here at the bottom of this slide that in addition, we found ourselves in this position where we've served as a forum to hold discussions and really have, facilitate some analytical review about some of these kind of emerging complex issues like CWD, PFAS, the environmental contaminant. Of course, now with COVID, some of the COVID related challenges we have found that we have this unique forum where we can bring issues and kind of kick them around and say, how can we get better coordinated around these issues that are of importance to all the parties at the table in a way that helps us think about how we're interacting and how we're sharing information better. And so trying to tie into some of those existing groups that might be working in CWD, but how can we go past the science and talk about how we're interacting as management professionals about it. So we found ourselves with the MLI kind of between this place of working on landscape conservation, traditional landscape conservation issues, but also being a valuable forum to tackle some of these other kind of emerging issues as well. And so I just included these slides more to show our members at the bottom, to show that they're representative of broad groups, but just to kind of let you know the types of things that they're working on. So we have an at-risk work group, and that's the group that's really looking to try to get more coordinated around species of greatest conservation need and at-risk species around the region. And so they've identified a few elements in their current work plan. Again, they're doing things like trying to work on getting a regional species of greatest conservation list together. They're working on some pollinator pilot projects to look at some different habitat issues related to some certain pollinators. And so we're just starting to see some work come online for them, but really getting that regional species of greatest conservation need list together across the Midwest is going to be a really big building block for our group. It'll allow us to really kind of talk in apples to apples or more apples to apples types of ways. And we also recognize that we represent a geography that's challenging in this regard, because we have from, the western Kansas to eastern Ohio, very different. And so part of the conversation too is how do we come up with some of these regional lists that make sense without diluting those lists as well, and taking away their meaningfulness. So those are part of the conversations we're having. They're in the process of going through that regional species of greatest conservation need. And we're looking at actually working with the NWF to use its affiliates to start communicating broadly about, what swaps are and why are these SGCNs important? How can we get more public engagement on their importance? And this kind of feeds into some other work as well happening at the national level about the importance of swaps, and how swaps might be an important building block in more beyond the federal aid and the wildlife sport fish restoration process that's used, how we might be able to link some of these swaps and really use them for our regional planning more. For our wind group, we have a facilitator who's actually working with us to help us go through a needs assessment process. There's so many groups working in a wind space. We knew that our directors really wanted us to work in wind and address this as a big issue. But when we first came together, we identified there are so many groups who are working in wind. And so we have gone through this needs assessment to figure out, where is there a gap and what niche can we serve? And what we have found is that there are very few peer-to-peer government work groups. We do a really good job of working across large groups when it comes to wind, but there's very few places where states and just state wind groups and wildlife groups can come and share and talk about resources and best management practices. And so we've held this space as a State Fish and Wildlife Agency, USGS Fish and Wildlife Service group. But we are looking at ways that we can engage with some of the different industry partners and utility partners, because we know it's important that we share what we're doing and what we're thinking, but we are trying to hold a space to be a uniquely government sharing space. And so again, they're looking they have some objectives identified, and they're working through really all of them right now. We're going to have a meeting of state partners soon, and hopefully Fish and Wildlife Service, Ecological Services, field office leaders soon, so that we can talk about the needs assessment and talk about what this group is doing, and get some more information out there to our government colleagues. We're also going through literature reviews. Maintaining those working relationships with wind companies is really important. But again, we're being really cognizant that this is a very full space. And so we're trying to fill those places where there's need and nothing to meet it right now. And then we have that habitat assessment work group. And really what they're looking at doing is exploring what are all the different habitat assessment tools that are out there, and what are people using and not using. We have a lot of data in our world, and how are we using it, and how really do we want some of our partners to be using that data, and how can we take some of these existing platforms and systems and fine tune them or iterate them or connect them where it needs to be. And so there's a lot of exploration underway. I use the word survey. I know we need to be careful with that, but the partners are looking at how can we figure out what people are using and do more of an inventory of what's out there. And then hopefully be a place where we can help create a blueprint or a model or whatever is identified as needed. And we're looking to go through a structured decision-making process to figure out what that looks like, so that we can be very intentional in asking the right questions and having the right people there to talk about what's possible and what's needed and what already exists and what absolutely will never be tolerated. We were looking to have that sooner than later, but due to COVID, we needed to postpone it because that's something best done in person. But what we found is that it's probably good for us to do more of the survey and inventory work before we jump to the what do we need stage. So we're going to stay in this exploration stage a little bit longer here. We had a technical committee retreat a couple weeks ago virtually, just to connect with all these individuals. We try to do this once a year, and again, we're only in really our second year of being functional. So it's a really important opportunity for us as we're kind of setting our course, to make sure that we have these opportunities where we can just talk about the planning and just talk about kind of the what if we could type statements. And so we're looking at what came out of that retreat summary were these major themes of wanting to have a very coordinated conservation strategy across the Midwest, engagement across states and multiple sectors and partners. Really, communication was a big one. Prioritizing that proactive long-term work. Again, there's that tension between being able to work in that space, because we don't often get to, because we're responding to the emergencies of the day. So really being intentional and mindful of this space we have here to work on that proactive long-term work. There was quite a bit of discussion about the value of organizing our work around state wildlife action plans, more needed for better internal coordination, always talking about the role of social science and making sure that what we're doing is connected to people, and how we connect our messages to both the practitioners in our field, but then broadly to others. Making sure we have evaluation. So are we effective? Are we needed? Because we certainly don't. We know there are not enough resources to address all of the challenges we have, and so none of us want to waste our time doing something that is not needed. And so we constantly are asking ourselves, do we still need to be doing this? And then, logistical and funding support, the challenges of trying to pull together all of these different bureaucracies and figuring out how you can share and pool funds. We don't have a community foundation. So how do we work across all of, again, these different bureaucracies, these big governments that we do, and still be flexible and innovative to the needs of the group? And so those are kind of the big things that we identified in places where we want to be working over the next couple of years. So again, I talked a little bit about this tension we find ourselves in. I mentioned it a lot because it's, again, something we really have to be mindful of when we start working on issues like CWD, that can take all my time. And so we want to be very intentional that it's important that we work in that space, and that we're relevant, and that we can make a difference there. We understand that wildlife diseases, environmental contaminants, invasive species can have really big landscape effects. So there's a connection, but we also don't want our time to just be eaten up by it. So we're constantly working through that tension at every level of our organization, at every level of the initiative, to make sure that we're trying to keep our focus on these big landscape level conservation issues. I'm going to admit right here that I am not a graphic designer. I've actually sought the services of one to help me visualize some of this a little bit more, so please bear with me. But what I'm trying to show here is, as the MLI is in its early infancy, its development phase, we identified these big priorities: at-risk species, species of greatest conservation need, habitat assessment tools, this convening authority we have. We identified these as our priorities because we need to get a better handle around them. And we wanted to make sure that we based whatever actions we do on rigorous review. And so right now with the at-risk group, we're going through a regional SGCN process. That will help us identify so many opportunities for possible, more narrowly defined goals. And so, we have one, wind energy, that was kind of eating the lunch of people when we set this up back in 2018. And so we have kind of that one very narrow, it's not narrow, but, more focused priority. And we could see where, as we go through this RSGCN process, we might be able to identify other more narrow priorities. And these are not our priorities, and these italicized. So again, I want to emphasize, these are not our priorities, but we could see where they could be. Just the groups that the technical committee and the working groups that we're working with, you can kind of start to see where our big challenges might involve things like grassland birds, connected streams, mussels. We can start to think where we can start to imagine where we think we're going to go, but we're using that rigorous process of going through that RSGCN to help us get there. And so right now we have these work groups around at-risk and habitat assessment. We can see where those might over time become our pillars of the MLI. They'll become kind of the basis of the MLI and how we approach where we're going to work. But for now, there are priority areas. Our priority areas could become some of, again, these more narrowly defined places. And over on the innovations and kind of more urgent issues, again, we want to hold this space to be working in some of these places. So we've had an event around chronic wasting disease, where we've come up with some recommendations regionally about how we can get better organized. So not about curing chronic wasting disease or stopping the spread or slowing the spread. It's about how can we as professionals in this community get better organized around that issue. Same thing with PFAS, which are contaminants in the Great Lakes mostly. Having work groups that are starting to organize around how are different groups reacting and responding, and how can we learn leverage from each other. We can see where biotechnology and conservation might be an issue we want to keep track of. Again, it's not something we're working on now, so it's italicized, but that's the kind of, we want to keep a little bit of space to stay on those innovations and make sure that we can pull together groups to get organized, particularly as they might later have an impact on some of our landscape issues. So how does this all come together? Where do we see this all going? So you can see we're coming up with our RSGCN. We know that there are all these other, plans, USGS plans, Fish and Wildlife Service plans. We're developing our conservation vision, and we're going to put all that together in this churn and come up with our conservation strategy, our Midwest conservation strategy. Again, I'm not a graphic designer, hoping to work with someone who can help me, show this maybe a little visually better, but taking that strategy and adding it to all the different GIS resources we have, Fish and Wildlife Service data standards, integration with other tools that might be existing. So the Missouri Landscape Health Initiative, the Nebraska Environmental Review Tool. I know there are multiple data sets that the migratory bird joint ventures have. Some of the other just blueprints and frameworks. And then also engaging with some of our other users. Something that was very important to our technical committee is making sure that we don't just have tools for our fish and wildlife community, but we have tools that are usable for all the groups that we interact with. So the agricultural community, working lands, with energy sectors, with highway sectors. How can we come up with resources that they want, need, and use to reach our goals? And so all of that mixed together to come up with a Midwest habitat assessment tool. And that's not the name. I know groups go through lots of different processes to come up with names for their tools, but just wanted to get the idea that if we need one, all of this information, all of this data coming together to go into something that we would see as our comprehensive habitat assessment tool. And I have a big caveat with this slide too. What this slide represents is kind of the convergence of the crucial habitat assessment tool in the West, chat, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy in the Southeast, CCAS, and Nature's Network in the Northeast. And I know that there are no shortage of other tools that are out there, but these are three really big landscape level tools that are used across broad regions of the United States right now. And when we're looking at some, kind of our counterparts in different parts of the country, this is kind of what we're seeing them develop. And so what I want to show with this map is that right now, for comprehensive species management, we are not aware, and again, we're going through this inventory, we're not aware of a tool like this for the entire, Midwest region. Again, we know there's this great environmental review tool in Nebraska, and Missouri's got this landscape health index that they're working on, and we're working with them on. The Great Lakes have some great resources. Again, we know all of our different partners in the different Fish and Wildlife Service programs have different planning tools, but we kind of are looking at this area thinking, is there room, is there space, is there need to have something there that would work for all the parties? And so again, I put a big caveat on this, and that this is kind of driving some of our inquiry, but we know we have a lot to learn here. Big opportunity area. So our timeline in the MLI, so so far, in the last, about 2 years that since we've been given authority to go, we've established our governance structure. We've populated our different groups, our different committees and work groups, and we've established a priority setting framework. So we have a framework that we can use to figure out, what do we consider a shared priority? And that's been kind of talked about with our steering committee and worked through our technical committee, so that we can review our priorities, give them time to work a bit, but go back and review them to make sure that we're timely and we have the right priorities. We have developed preliminary action plans in each one of the work groups. So each one of them has a pretty detailed action plan with some key steps that go into the next 2 to 5 years. We have a draft conservation strategy where we've taken those different action plans and kind of rolled them together. We need a lot of work here because the technical committee decided they wanted it to be very integrated and not just, the representation of 3 different work groups. They really wanted it to be a comprehensive and robust document that was integrated. We're going through a lot of exploratory processes. So as I mentioned, we're looking into, what different data sets and systems exist, what different mapping systems exist, what are needs out there, and, of course, our SGCN process. Over the next 6 months, we're looking to develop a communication engagement strategy that will involve external affairs and communication professionals from that entire 13-state region, but from the service and the states as well. And we're looking to finalize that initial Midwest conservation strategy, so that kind of more integrated strategy that we'll then have available for public review and input. Over the next year, as I mentioned, we will be working with our consultant to develop that RSGCN and have that rigorous process to develop the database and review framework. Part of what we're doing there is developing not only a list, but a process so that we can continuously refine and update that list. So we don't need to call this consultant in all the time and have them update it, and it's not static. It's something that can be living and that we can go back and review, particularly as the states update their swaps as is required. So then over the next 2 to 5 years, where we see this all going is once we, again, have that RSGCN and we can start to kind of more narrowly, identify some more of those focused priority areas. We'll have, some identification of those specific targeted either habitat types or species groups that we'll be wanting to work in, locational initiatives. But our priorities will probably shift in the MLI away from these kind of big pillar concepts to more specific outcome-based priorities. And again, we'll also be looking at whether or not we need to have some kind of habitat assessment tool or iteration of existing tools or combination of tools. But that's something that we'll be probably making decisions on, again, over the next 2 to 5 years, and making decisions on and then acting on those decisions. So some of the questions I know that were posed about, our interaction here, so what challenges does the MLI face incorporating other conservation plans into the regional perspective? So that's a huge place for us, and of course, the challenges you can imagine. I know a lot of people here probably work across different states, but data is kept, stored, managed in all different ways, and we know. I know just from some of the work I've done in the service, just from consultant to consultant, you can have different ways the data is shared, and so just trying to find all of the different plans, understand how those plans are used. This is where we want to really use social science to understand the connections that some different people or groups have to the plans they're using, because we can come up with the greatest tool in the world, but if someone loves what they use, they're not going to use this other one. And so how can we take into account what is out there, and then understand why they're being used, and then whether or not there's potential for it to be improved or to be extended to be more relevant to other groups across the region. So this, we know we face a lot of challenges here But what's important to us is that we don't want to create just another plan for our group. What's important is that we take in all different kinds of plans and make them kind of part of how we're considering going forward. So that, like for example, this morning, I'm talking with a peer from Missouri, and he's going through a pretty arduous planning process with several federal agencies and other state agencies. And we're thinking, wouldn't it be terrific if we had some of the different plans that we're thinking about coming together for the tools that we had for the MLI, that all these different agencies were kind of contributing to or participating with, so that the information could kind of just draw from that shared resource. And then, on the flip side, making sure that we have something that the different states can feed, so that, it just, we get better data, we get more data, but when you do that, we all understand the challenges of, data maybe not being collected equally. Is the data good enough for a management decision or a legal action? And there's all these different considerations that we need to take into account as we figure out what different plans we want to use and what our plans look like. But those are all the pieces that we're thinking about, and why we decided not to have that structured decision-making process to jump into, okay, what do we need to create? Because we understood that we needed to know a lot more about what is out there and what is important as we're thinking about possibly developing something or iterating something into the future. So the next question we have is, how do we approach SGCN? And again, what we're looking to do is build this regional species of greatest conservation need list that will kind of become foundational to the work of the MLI. We're hoping that this will really help set our priorities. We'll identify some of those habitat types, or again, species groups that we really need to be focusing on, different locations. Again, our challenge is that in our region, you think about it, North Dakota, Kentucky, Ohio, Kansas, it's just very broad. And so, we've talked about, is there a need to, kind of have an east and west, or a north and south, or a lakes and a grass? And, so we're talking about how we can make sure that we're coming up with some kind of regional list in ways that make sense, so that we're not diluting the list and getting, maybe 5 species on a list because those are the only 5 we can agree on, when we know we have so much more work to do. So that's part of our challenge. And then also looking to what our neighboring regions are doing and trying to make sure we're connecting in, so that as we get closer to the edges of our boundary, we can make sure we have those seamless interactions, along the west and the northeast and the southeast with some of those other initiatives. So we're using species of greatest conservation need as kind of a baseline for the work we're doing. And part of my challenge, my personal, for my job this year, in addition to helping coordinate this effort, is I'm going to be working internally with my Fish and Wildlife Service partners in the region and around, to figure out how we make sure that what we're doing is meaningful and supportive and helpful to all of the Fish and Wildlife Service programs in our region as well. And then, so the final question is, what is needed to make integration of conservation actions by multiple partners across large spatial scales possible? And I have so many answers to this question. I think what we're doing with the MLI is we're discovering so much of this. So we know that one is having the space to even come together and ask these big questions. What do we need to do? Bringing these conservation groups together around a couple key priority issues, whether it be a species or, in our case, at-risk species, but having the space and the support of our senior leadership in the region to say, we need to come together and we need to have a place where we can talk about this and plan for this. So that first and foremost is the first key. Then we start getting into, I know that we're going to get into situations with data sharing and working across some of the different requirements across states, different privacy laws that might be there. And so I think, again, having that dedicated capacity, having people who can be there just to work through some of these issues, I say I unfurl the knots a lot, but we try to identify what is the next thing, what is the next piece that we need to kind of pick apart and come up with an approach to. And that just takes people and time. And so part of what we've found very important is having, having the MAFWA liaisons who are dedicated to supporting this work. Because that just capacity to attend to those issues, hold those discussions, act on the findings of a group between, from one meeting to the next is really critical as you work through some of those really tricky issues about what it means to share data and to think about, taking on activities together, whether, again, sharing data or developing a grant, state wildlife action, state wildlife grant to do something collaboratively, working on, there's so many places where it just takes a person to implement this idea, this notion of working across these scales. I know there's some efforts with swaps as part of some of these national discussions going on about what can we do to, streamline swaps. Each state right now is developing their own swap, and rightfully so. But are there elements ways that we can be thinking about how the swaps can be used for collaboration, and are there ways that we can approach the swaps that make it easier to collaborate across state boundaries? And so that's another place where we're looking at what is possible there. And again, that will need to be state led, because a lot of that is about state planning. But how can more partners use those state wildlife action plans in meaningful ways beyond how they might be used now? That's another place to explore. Certainly funding challenges are out there. Again, I mentioned in the Midwest, we don't really have a community investment pool where we can take resources and put money into something. The different organizations have their responsibilities. So, it can be really tricky sometimes to try to spend money together, and how you contract and how you distribute funds. And again, with all the different requirements that state and federal agencies have in spending funds, that can be challenging. And so far we're navigating it, but it's not as easy as if you just had kind of a shared pot of money that you could go to and spend. That's just not the way that we're made. And so we're working through that. And I could, of course, say that right now, COVID is going to present challenges because we understand that all the different state budgets are being impacted. We don't know yet what the federal budgets will look like, but that's impacting travel. It will impact the amounts of funds that are going to be available for some of this work. And honestly, sometimes some of this planning work and forward thinking work, it can feel like not the urgent crisis work. I need to put out the fires. And so, we're fortunate in that we have been prioritized so far as important work. But I hope we stay that way, because I do understand that some of our partners are facing some pretty austere times ahead. And so how can we make our processes work so that in a way that doesn't take as much of their time and resources, even though it's still important. So what is needed there, I think, are going to be all of these things we're getting to experiment with now, which are these remote tools, the ability to collaborate across, across distance, the ability to put in place some of these planning milestones that we're held accountable to a time frame, but we're still able to interact in very meaningful ways. And so my silver lining with COVID has been that I've always worked remotely in this position. This has actually made my work a lot easier because now everybody's getting really good at working remotely, and we're figuring out what better tools we might have and resources we might have. And while I miss collaborating with everyone in person, and I wish I could be at the meeting this week to meet with people and talk more in the halls and all the ways that you connect with people, I'm finding that we're getting quite good at figuring out how we can have some of these meetings and work across these spaces. So I think, just talking about how we collaborate is something that's going to be needed. So, it's commitment, it's capacity, and it's, some of these sharing tools. Getting a Department of Interior SharePoint site that would allow non-Department of Interior people in it was a game changing for our group, because now we can collaborate in real time. So even, just kind of some of these small things have been really helpful and very needed. So I hope that answers questions people have. I have my contact information there, and I included my cell phone number, which is always the best way to reach me anyway. But I am teleworking like so many from my home right now. Kind of, I don't know when I'll get back in the office. So my cell phone will be the best way to reach me for quite a while. I'm actually located in the Kansas City area. I work out of the Meyers National Wildlife Refuge, which is just south of the Kansas City metro. And so I'm in Central Time, pretty accessible. And if you have any questions at all, want to follow up, want to get engaged with the MLI, want to connect in, if you have some of those habitat assessment tools that you're using or different databases that you're using that you're like, you need to know about this, please contact me. But I'm happy to connect you in with our group. We are, as I mentioned, we are young. We're growing, and we're trying to figure out where we can be the most beneficial to the groups that are working in conservation. And so if there's an opportunity to help, even just be a forum to discuss what's possible, we can do that. And then, like we did with CWD, we held that discussion, and then, we kind of gave it back to some other groups to figure out what they wanted to do with it. But we do have that facilitation capability with this group. So I really appreciate the time today, and look forward to hearing from all of you, and just appreciate everything everyone does out there.